In this video, I'll be jumping onto the CD ROM craze like it's 1993. But first, some background. By the start of 93, the hype around CD ROM had reached new heights. Game consoles were announced left and right that would use the new format, and the PC wasn't far behind. Especially hyped was the 3DO for having better graphics than the other options, although some pessimists pointed out its high price. The CDI, on the other hand, was pointed out as possibly more versatile, offering more than just gaming to justify its existence. The Amiga CD32 was promising, until Commodore went bankrupt less than a year after its release. Sega released a CD-ROM add-on for their Mega Drive console. Nintendo, meanwhile, had given up on their CD-ROM experiments and insisted that CD-ROM wasn't the future. Anyway, now that we talked about consoles, how will I get in on this? By 1993, there were a number of options for adding a CD-ROM drive to a computer, and they came in several types. When putting the CD into the drive, some drives require the CD to be put into a caddy first. Other drives would just pop out a tray. And then there's the Mitsumi way. Some drives had their own custom proprietary interface. Others used SCSI. CD-ROM drives connecting to the ATA bus like an IDE hard drive wasn't really a thing yet. Then there's the single speed and multi-speed drives. Multi-speed drives could read a disk faster by spinning it faster, and they were generally preferred. With all of these options, what do I get? Easy. The cheapest way to add a CD-ROM drive to my system. The Mitsumi option. It's a basic single-speed drive with its own custom interface, and it uses its own unique way of loading the disk. Reviews described it as cheap feeling and a bit quirky, but seemingly sufficient robust, with adequate performance. I'll be installing it in the computer I built back in the 1992 season. Now that I've decided what CD-ROM drive I'm getting, I got to install it into my computer. Since I don't want the CD-ROM drive to be blocked by my keyboard, I decided to move the floppy drives down. I basically never use the 5¼ inch drive, so I don't mind the keyboard interfering with that. After struggling a bit like usual with one of the screws holding the hard drive cage in, it was time for the interface board. CMOS checksum failure. For some reason, my BIOS settings cleared after installing the interface board. It only happened once and I'm not sure why. Anyway, after putting in the information again, my computer was booting into DOS. Then I just got to put the case on and install the drivers. There are two drivers to choose from. One uses DMA and interrupts, the other uses none of that and just pulls the drive. The DMA driver has less performance overhead, especially in a multitasking environment. The other driver uses less RAM and is more compatible in case of resource conflicts. There are no separate drivers to install for Windows. I went with the simpler of the two drivers. So, now that I got a CD ROM drive, what do I do with it? One reoccurring discussion topic was the enormous amount of data that could be stored on a disk. My hard drive is 240 megabytes, while a single CD ROM could hold 650. Databases and such was touted as a big future use case, allowing you to have access to huge amounts of information in an easily searchable way. Multimedia encyclopedias like Microsoft Encarta was also a promising applications. In these early days they were quite costly. This copy of Encarta would cost more than my CD ROM drive. Encarta would come down to a reasonable price in 1994 already, but that's not now. One use, however, that saw almost immediate success was shareware collection CDs. As an example, I got Walnut Creek's Simtel CD ROM. Simtel was a shareware archive focused on MS-DOS software, hosted by the US Army for some reason. Here I found something that looks useful, a binary file editor. Nowadays we'd call it a hex editor. With a few selections I'll get it unpacked onto my hard drive right off the CD ROM. This kind of software was also widely available on BBSs, but browsing and installing off of a CD ROM is arguably more convenient. Aside from programs and utilities, there is also a fair amount of programming resources on here. Another obvious application was music. Music had been available on CD for a decade at this point, but far from every home had a CD player. Vinyl records and cassette tapes were still prevalent, so it's not unreasonable that the CD ROM drive in your computer was also your first CD player. And your computer could do a decent job at playing CDs too, especially if you connect it to some good speakers, like I haven't. So I can just put this music CD in the drive, start up this utility that came with the drivers, and hit play. Can even close the program and keep the music playing in the background while I'm working. But enough with that. We're here for the games. I've picked out two games to have a look at. Manic Mansion, Day of the Tentacle, and The Seventh Guest. They both use the CD ROM format a bit differently, which I think is worth discussing. Let's start with The Day of the Tentacle. It's a classic point-and-click adventure game. It was released simultaneously on both floppy disk and CD ROM. They were basically the same, except the CD ROM version added full voice acting to all dialogue. So it's more or less just a floppy disk edition with enhancements. Additionally, the CD ROM edition could also run straight off the disk, meaning it wouldn't take any space on your hard drive. However, streaming everything off the disk has some disadvantages, especially if your CD ROM drive is slow like mine. Let's jump into the game and see why.
I'm thirsty.
I don't think you should drink that. It looks bad for you.
Nonsense. It makes me feel great. Smarter. More aggressive. I feel like I could. Like I could. Like I could. Take on the world.
Aha! A secret passage. This is all too easy.
Kumquats. Looks better now. Why, I'd show you a thing or two if there were a cherry tree nearby. But as you can see, there... Oh, well, what do you know? There is a cherry tree out there. Well, let's go chop the sucker down.
I said come down from there at once!
Try to understand. I'm stuck in this...
Next, let's have a look at the seventh guest. It's a bit of a killer app for the CD ROM format for home computers. The reviews I saw all described this as impressive. It's built around pre-rendered graphics and animations. It was so huge that it was basically impossible to release on floppy without some serious cutting. As such, it was a CD ROM exclusive. The graphics and animations is streamed in from the disk in real time to create an interactive game. The idea was that high-end workstations can pre-render stunning graphics, meaning that the end user doesn't need a very powerful computer to play a pretty game. It was also noted in the reviews that there was quite a bit of stutter and noticeable load time with a single-speed CD ROM. I'm honestly not too bothered by it. The general instability, however, is a bit worse.
Welcome to my house. Lady?
I'm not sure we should have been here today.
Why? Because it's a spooky old house? Don't worry, Jim. I'll watch out for you.
What stuff? I expected more stuff.
Lord, it smells awful too. What's Storm been doing here?
You'll need more than lenses to focus your thoughts on this one.
And there's a bit of the instability I was talking about. Anyway, I think that's enough of this video. Check back next week when I'll be making a game like it's 1993. Until then, thank you for watching.